Okay, hey there, and welcome to today's Tech and Learning Leadership Roundtable, Leading with MTSS, Implementation Strategies for Student Success. I'm Dr. Keisha Ray, Brand Ambassador for Tech and Learning, and I'm excited to be your host today. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to have a great session over the next hour. But before we get started, let's do some introductions. So as you guys are coming into the room, can you please give your name and where you're from and maybe the role that you hold in that organization so that we can all become a little bit more acquainted with you and what you do in your day-to-day life? And then while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and thank our good friends at Otis for making this time together possible. And these roundtables are great ways to learn on the go, and they offer extended learning time because we have recordings that are going to be accessible on the Tech and Learning website. So you can share them with your friends and share them in professional development activities that you offer throughout your school or district. So now let's see who's in the room. Man, we have some really amazing people. North Carolina, NYC. Hey, Christine, how are you? Rockford, Illinois. They have amazing career academies in Rockford. So good to see you, Tracy and Nikita. Yay, interventionist. We're speaking your language, Nikita. We're so glad you're here. Jonathan from Phoenix. How hot is it in Phoenix, Jonathan? It's 77 in Nashville and I'm burning up. So I don't even think I could possibly dream of living in Phoenix, but do drop that temp in there so we know at least how hot it is. Bunch of people from Texas coming in, and Julie, sorry. 75, good. It's hotter in Nashville than it is in Phoenix. That's got to be a record. Wowzy. Well, we have some wonderful panelists here today. The incredible Amanda Ironside is joining us again to continue our MTSS conversation. She's the director of the MTSS Center at First Educational Resources, and she helps school leaders nationwide strengthen pedagogical practices within their communities. And we also have the incredible Kendall Hunter, who is the product marketing manager at Otis. She's a former special ed teacher, and she is one of my favorite people to do webinars with because she's just so chill and cool and so knowledgeable about her area and has so much to offer our audience. So thank you, Kendall and Amanda, for being here with us today. During our time together a couple of weeks ago, Amanda and Kendall and I geeked out over the MTSS framework, and we discussed how data can really help inform the way we support and move students through the framework, which is like the goal, right? But this week, we're going to double down and start talking about the original intervention, which is Tier 1 instruction. And before we get started, I want to encourage our audience members to participate in the chat along the way. Feel free to submit questions there in the chat, or you can use the Q&A button that's below probably the window in your screen. So let's kick it off. Are you ready, Amanda? And
I am ready.
yes. And Kendall's going to go dark for just a half a second. So Amanda and I can chat about Tier 1. And then Kendall's going to come in when we start talking about data and technology solutions. So,
Yeah.
or we
Great.
dive into Tier 1, my friend Amanda, can you give a quick recap of what we talked about during our previous time together? This is a quiz for
Yeah.
anybody who was on that webinar last
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. And I do see some returning participants, so that's great. Welcome back, and welcome to those of you that are joining us for the first time with this second part to our webinar. Again, I'm Amanda Ironside. I am a consultant for First Educational Resources, and today our focus is on MTSS, our MTSS framework, but focusing more on that Tier 1 and that core instruction. So before we get into that, though, I wanted to give a little bit of back-end knowledge on what MTSS is. And basically, it's an instructional framework. It's a system. And so, and what we found is that when you have this type of system, that achievement gaps are going to decrease. We use data as our catalyst for those conversations and change. And then we have that shared value and belief as a team because we're all using that same framework and that same system. Okay, so when you think about your MTSS framework within your district or in your building, is it working the way that you need it to? When you really reflect on the 3 questions that are on your screen, where do you fit? So just take a moment and think to yourself, like, where am I in terms of my district or my building with these 3 questions?
Oops. And when we think about MTSS, can you, just for our audience that's joining us today, can you
Mm-hmm.
link it up with RTI and what people know?
Yeah.
Because in our conversation last week, we
Yeah.
had that kind of talking point of, well,
Yes.
we used to do this, didn't we?
Yep, yep. So RTI, the response to intervention, started as more of a framework for intervention for us to, as a system, determine who are those students that are in need of support and scaffolds, and how do we instruct and plan our instruction for those students. So when we move to MTSS, which is that multi-tier system of support, what we started to notice was that the same data that we were collecting for our RTI purposes was giving us additional data and additional realizations in terms of purpose and action. So now we're starting to look at behavioral data. We're starting to look at attendance data. We're looking at our students that are in need of intervention, but maybe on the other end, which we'll get to in just a moment. So we're starting to use all of this data in a way that we can look at more than just that one purpose. And so what happens is it turns into this, it's a big framework that is full of many different moving parts. And that's why it's really important that as a district or as a building, that you are working together as a system. Because to summarize it, these are the parts of MTSS, but within each of those main parts are a lot of different parts. So in order to have it be effective and efficient, everyone has to follow that framework and be on board with what we're doing as a district or as a building. So just to kind of go back a little bit, when we're talking about MTSS and that multi-tier, we're talking about those 3 tiers of instruction and 3 tiers of, or 2 tiers of intervention in a sense, right? So tier 1 is our focus for today, and that is that core universal instruction. And it is also the most important component, which we will talk a lot about today and go back to today, because it includes the instructional practices that are research-based and proven to benefit and strengthen our learners' growth and achievement, regardless of their readiness level. You know, at tier 1, at our universal general classroom instruction, we have a lot of learner variability. And it makes your each classroom look a little bit different. Okay, but universal instruction, one thing that's constant is that universal instruction, that tier 1 instruction, always is planned with grade level standards, and so that's where it keeps tier 1 uniform across a district or across a building. And you'll notice with those arrows there that as we move through the tiers, our need is intensified. So at that tier 2 is now where we've identified students that are in need of that small group targeted instruction, and that tier 3 is where those students that are needed more in need of that one-on-one or two-on-one really intensive targeted intervention.
And you know, Amanda, when we think about interventions, we think a lot about evidence-based strategies. Like, what
Mhm.
does the research say we should do around an intervention? And when we even look at ESSA tiers, that's kind of what they're looking at, right? Is what
Right.
evidence do we have that this particular program does what it says it's going to do? But when we think about tier 1, sometimes I feel like that gets a little watered down. Like, we don't look
Yep.
at it as intentionally as we should, when that's, like, literally ground level. Like, that's, like,
Yep.
phase 1 of any kind of support for learning. So, can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about just evidence-based instructional strategies, ar
Yeah.
in tier 1?
Absolutely. So one of the most important questions that we need to be asking ourselves is, are we truly providing grade level instruction? And are we planning towards those grade level standards and targets? So what we found, or what the research shows in an MTSS framework, is that typically 80% of learners should be meeting those grade level standards and expectations without any additional interventions or extensions. Okay, so if you're thinking about your classroom right now, your building, your district, could you confidently say that about 80% of your learners are at that grade level? Okay, now if you find that percentage to be less, that's when we really have to look into our tier 1 instruction. We have to look at how we're going to strengthen that tier 1 instruction, because without high quality evidence-based tier 1 instruction, tier 2 and tier 3 will not be as effective as we thought they were going to be. Okay, so I found this really interesting. This is from a research project from the Opportunity Myth. And what they found, and just to give you a little back here, they used data from 1,000 lessons, 5,000 assignments, 20,000 work samples, 30,000 students. I mean, a lot of research, right? But I just found that this really interesting is that 71% of students succeeded on the assignment, but only 17% actually met the grade level standards on the same exact assignment. So if you really think about that, it's like, wow, that is quite a difference. And what does that mean, right? So the question for today is, how are we going to strengthen that tier 1 instruction? And when we're running into the needs that are higher at tier 2 and tier 3, sometimes we think the solution should just be to keep putting more students in intervention, right? So, and that's in our best intentions, because okay, we're identifying that we have a lot of students that need tier 2, we've got a lot of students that need tier 3. Okay, we're just going to keep putting more people, putting more interventionists, we're going to keep putting more kids into these interventions. But it's most likely not going to get us the results that we thought we were going to get, because what that's telling us is that our tier 1 instruction is probably not as strong as we think it is, or as it should be. Okay, so when we're thinking about if we know if our universal instruction is effective, again, these are those 3 things, those kind of big ideas, that if we have a strong tier 1 instruction, we also have these 3 things. And we're always thinking about this. We're always thinking about, where are my students now? Where do I want them to go? How am I going to get them there? And how will I know when they are there? That is right here. This cycle is going to strengthen your tier 1 instruction just by thinking about these questions as you're planning your lessons, as you're planning your unit, as you're looking at your data. Where are they now? Where do I want them to be? How am I going to get there? How do I know that they're there?
And not necessarily by putting them in an intervention. I think
Correct.
I think that sometimes we think about the student, like where we need to place the student, rather than like first, rather than thinking reflectively about our teaching practice and what we might need to do differently or modify to get our students where they need to be. Like the orange part of your error, how am I going to get them there? Is not always, well, we'll put them in an intervention over here. Sometimes, probably many times, more times than not, it's what do I need to change or modify about my instructional practice that can meet my students where they are and move them where they need to be. Is that a fair?
You hit it right on the head. Yes, absolutely. So, and I think with, again, our best intentions, we adopt an MTSS framework and we think that that kids are in these silos of tier one, tier two, or tier three, which, by the way, we don't use that terminology, right? We don't say these are tier one students, tier two students, tier three students, right? So, what we have to look at is what is happening in tier one in order to get our students to where they need to be in terms of grade level standards and expectations. And some of the things that we use in tier two and tier three for strategies, such as small group instruction, intensive interventions or I shouldn't say interventions, but intensive scaffolds and supports, those should also be in tier one. Like that's still good instruction. And just because I'm pulling a small group during my tier one core instruction time doesn't mean that I'm moving to a tier two intervention. That's two very different things, right? So I think we have to remember that universal and core instruction still has to have what we know as is good instruction, that we're not just saving that for our tier two and tier three instruction as well.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
I was at a school last week and on like a walkthrough, if you will.
Mhm.
And we were this particular school has low performance right now. And one of the things that we were talking about was PLCs. And I said, PLCs are the tier one of professional development. Like that's where you come together and that's where your kind of boots on the ground work should be on reflecting on your teaching practice, looking at the standards, looking at how your kids are performing, and then designing instruction, preferably as a PLC, as a group that's going to move your kids. What are your thoughts on planning and assessment of grade level standards and how teachers should attend to their planning and to their kind of assessments on an
Mhm.
ongoing basis in tier one?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, like these four questions are those key questions, right? If you're looking at your classroom data, let's say you're looking at an exit slip that you just gave to students on a lesson that you had done, or let's say you're looking at assessment data from a unit assessment, or maybe it's your district assessment. These questions all come into play no matter what type of assessment it is. The planning piece is what's going to change a little bit, right? So that exit slip that you gave yesterday is giving you that just in time assessment data where you could take you could take the results from that exit slip and look it over and determine for tomorrow, this is how I'm going to change my instruction, or this is how my tier one core instruction is going to be a little modified based on the exit slip that I just gave. But when you're looking at a unit assessment, that's where you're going to use this same cycle. But now you're looking at, okay, these are the concepts that as a whole, my class understands and mastered, right? But now here's a couple where I'm noticing some pockets of students that I might need to reteach in small groups during my core one and core instruction, but I'm going to maybe pull some of these kids to do some reteaching during core time. And then you might have those district assessments where now it shifts to sort of that bigger idea where you're looking as a whole, like which buildings do we need to focus efforts on for this particular subject area? Or where do we need to put resources at in order to strengthen the instruction and the achievement that's happening? Or where are our students in our achievement high? What are they doing in that building that we want to emulate? So there's a lot of different questions that can be done depending upon the type of assessment that you're giving. However, these questions on your screen are the ones that are going to frame your planning no matter what type of planning it would be.
My
So
mute button wouldn't unmute.
that's
Yeah,
okay.
it's probably tired of me talking. Um, what about as pre-assessments? We think about universal screeners in a as a form of pre-assessment, But what about pre-assessments and just how do we know where kids are? And let me kind of add into this question. There are a lot of tools out there that offer pre-assessments that may or may not be aligned to standards for your
Yes.
state. So how give some advice on those tools and just in general pre-assessments
Yeah.
related to tier one and play.
So pre-assessment is of utmost importance when it comes to planning because it's going to provide you with the information and data that you need for a particular unit of study or maybe even a lesson or a big concept, because that's going to help you streamline your instruction to where it should be. If you've got a majority of your kids that are already showing proficiency towards adding fractions, let's say, but yet there's 4 lessons in your math resource about adding fractions, it's going to force you to think about, like, do I really need to teach all 4 in that, in the entirety, or do I compact those because most of my kids already know how to do it and then meet in a small group with those that need more instruction. So just some sort of thoughts that you're going to start to have when you look at that pre-assessment data. But like you said, Keisha, if you look at my first question or first check mark there, it's identifying the level of understanding around a grade level standard. And
Yep.
I think that's so important to understand because when we are looking through our textbook, which a lot of them nowadays do have standards aligned to them, but some that don't, and even the ones that do, sometimes the standard isn't well aligned. So we really need to look at our standards as opposed to what is being given to us in a resource. And that's going to help us plan our pre-assessment and then also gain knowledge from the data from our pre-assessment. And it's also going to aid in planning for our instruction and providing that data that's going to be now useful for that targeted grouping that you might do during your small group time. And I do
Yeah.
want to say that your pre-assessment doesn't have to be anything formal, right? It can be something like the different options that are on your screen. Like over on the left-hand side with the shapes, that's kind of a more formal pre-assessment. But if you look over to the right, like that top one, that is an agree or disagree type of pre-assessment where you get some interesting insights into your students' thinking as opposed to giving them that formal pre-assessment, right? And then the bottom 2 are more about asking kids, what do you know about this? What are questions that you have about this? And then that fifth to 5 is, just having kids say, we're going to be learning about the Pythagorean theorem tomorrow. Just give me a fist to 5 on how you feel about your understanding of that, and just gathering that quick data on where students feel they are at. So again, Keisha, like we said, it's 2 different types of data for pre-assessment. One's more concrete, like you can look at their work and say, okay, they get it or they don't. The other one is a more reflective pre-assessment. But again, metacognition has such a high effect size on student achievement that it's nice to use a combination of both or to vary it up throughout your units and lessons.
I love that because it also helps kids learn to their own learning. And
Yes.
how many times have we had kids in classrooms where we say, we're going to talk about blah, like I used to teach physics and science. And so I would say, how many of you have ever learned the elements of the periodic table? And everybody's, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I'm like, how many of you know what oxygen is? Hands go up. Okay, that's an
Mhm.
element on the periodic table. So they just don't, it could any given teacher could call it anything in context, and they don't know they know, so to speak. So if you
Right.
kind of try to get that little informal metacognition pre-assessment and then give them another maybe survey or 10
Mhm.
5 questions or whatever to do another quick assessment that's more concrete. That's a wonderful way. And I'm wondering in our planning process, I always say that assessment is part of instruction, that they're not 2 different activities. One informs the other and it's ongoing cycle. You can't have one without the other. So what are your thoughts and feelings on how integrated assessment is with general instructional practice?
Well, I think that sometimes we hear a lot like, oh, we're assessing our kids all the time. It's too much, it's too much, it's too much. Typically that when we hear that, we're talking about those bigger assessments or those district assessments and that take a long time. And we have to remember that each assessment has a purpose. And if we are not using our assessment data for a specific purpose, we're going to start feeling that way, right? We're going to say, like, why am I spending 5 days giving this assessment to my class and gathering this data? But, like, where does this data go now? What do we do with it? So, as a system, as a district, as a building, we have to make sure that the reason why we are giving these assessments is clear, and it's also understood the purpose, and that we know what we're going to do with this data now that we've collected it. And I think for teachers, that exit slip data, that unit assessment data, that obviously is much more personal in terms of our own instructional planning, because we can take that data right away and plan something with it, right? So we just have to make sure that if we are assessing, we're using what we're learning from that. Otherwise, the negativity towards assessment is right, because if we're not doing anything with the data, then why are we giving the assessment?
And kind of riffing from that, it's not good for the students to be involved in all this assessment if they're not getting any feedback from us. And I do see that a lot when I do
Yeah.
walkthroughs where, and I know it's overwhelming sometimes. A teacher can't give, a lot of attention to every single piece. If you add more assessments, then that's adding more grading, da da da. I totally get all of that. But at some point along the way, we do need to give feedback to students so they know how to improve. And more than just a looks good start. I'm guilty of that. I even had stamps that said that. I was like, and I even got so lazy, I didn't wanna even write it. I was just like, "I'll stamp it." But feedback is essential and critical, I believe. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I could go on for a longer webinar on feedback. But yes, it's of utmost importance too, because it kind of goes along with what I was talking about with the assessment. So there's that layer of, if teachers, we need to know the purpose of the assessment, while the feedback is the kids' understanding of the purpose of the assessment, right? So if we could give an assignment or a task, and at the end of it, if we don't provide feedback to the learner about what they did well using that strengths-based approach, they're going to maybe interpret it in a different way. We might have a third grader that's really, really excited because she's just started learning how to write in cursive. So she thinks to herself, I'm going to write my whole paragraph in cursive and it's going to be beautiful. And then she gets her sheet back and it says very good on it. And she's like, I know the cursive writing was very good, right? But she's not understanding that, oh, the content I actually wrote about was very good. So that specific actionable feedback is so important when we are working with our students and propelling them to that next level of understanding.
So true. And I mean, like I said, I'm as guilty as the next person for just not taking the time to do what needed to be done to give that feedback. I think
Yeah,
that's a justification for smaller class size, FYI. If anybody's out there, listening to this, we do need
right.
small class sizes so we can manage, we can have better tier one instruction if we have a class size that's much more effective for us to manage. So, we've talked about assessment. We've talked a lot about assessment. We've talked about feedback. It seems like there could be other pieces of data, and you alluded to some at the beginning, but if you could, let's for a few seconds talk about all the pieces of data that
Mhm.
we might need to consider specifically to identify needs for tier two. Like, we can't just be like, well, they're not passing these assessments. Like, there has to be more to me that we piece
Yes.
together. Tier 2 and tier 3 become a little bit more refined, and you can't do that without the right amounts of data.
Yeah. So our assessment data is going to change, or the types of assessment that we collect is going to change, but also have some that are very similar depending upon what tier of instruction we're in. And I've just brought this slide back up here because these are those like 6 pie pieces that really make up an MTSS framework. But then again, like I said, within each of those pieces, there's a lot of ingredients, right? And so in like this first one here, that universal instruction or universal screener, that is what is typically given at the beginning of a school year, or at the beginning of certain points in a school year that's going to launch into something, a bigger initiative that a grade level or a building or a district might have. So giving that universal screener is meaning that everybody is getting the same assessment, and we're able to gather data using the same criteria, and that way we can norm it as a for that particular assessment and those particular standards. And then that will help us get that broad view of our school, our district, that leads us into that tier 1 instruction, which is now going to be helpful to have a district diagnostic, a building diagnostic, a classroom unit assessment, any types of those pre-assessments that I had up on the screen. And there's so many more. And those are all those tier 1 assessments that we're used to giving, right? It's just the ones that are at the end of a unit or throughout the unit, those dipsticks are checks for understanding, right? But now tier 2 and tier 3 kind of go along. If we're talking about assessment, we're looking at that progress monitoring piece. And as we are working with our tier 2 instruction and in our tier 3 instruction, we are monitoring progress at a much more often than we might be doing in tier 1 instruction. Because with tier 2 and tier 3, remember that intensity increases in terms of targeted instruction. So in tier 2, a lot of times in buildings that I work with, tier 2 is a weekly or twice a week sort of progress monitoring that's formal, I guess I could say. And then tier 3 is almost every day, just to continue that data. But I do want to preface that by saying that in tier 2 and tier 3, you're kind of doing assessment every day because you're with that student. So it's like this anecdotal assessment. It's that observational assessment that you're going to have. But because when it moves into an intervention, that becomes more of a formalized process. So then we have to start kind of gathering data and tracking it in a more formalized manner. So your assessment definitely changes depending upon which tier of instruction that you're in. But the idea is the same, is that you're using it for a purpose and to plan your instruction.
And we have to have somewhere to put all that data and to review all
Yes.
that data, right? I mean,
Yes.
all of this sounds great. And even the feedback, I'm like, everything has to be easy for us to access and easy for us to pass on to teachers beyond us for right when Reagan goes to 3rd grade or 4th grade. And so we'll bring on the amazing Kendall, who is going to talk about technology and how some technologies can help us administer pre-assessments and use data in very meaningful ways. Kendall.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I've really been enjoying the conversation on the back end here. So thanks for letting me share a little bit more about Otis today. I know I've been with camera off for a few minutes here during the webinar, but for those I've yet to meet, my name is Kendall Hunter. I'm the product marketing manager at Otis, but I'm also a former middle school special education teacher, reading specialist. So the topic of today is certainly very timely to a lot of my own experiences, in the classroom as an educator, and now in my work with educators across the country at Otis. But to Keisha's question, thinking about how technology can help us to really streamline these processes, that's exactly what technology should do, because it's not easy, planning instruction for all of the different tiers of students and needs in your classroom. And that's really where technology comes into play, beginning, with the pre-assessment process all the way through to your post-assessment and the data analysis. When you want to really dissect what students know and do not know, that's where technology can really help us. And I am going to show you exactly what I mean by that and some specific examples of that streamlined experience. But I do want to set the stage with just a little bit of context about what Otis is as a tool before I show you a couple examples of this in action. So if you haven't heard of Otis, Otis is a tool that really unifies all of your student data. And what I mean by that is, as a former educator, I'm certainly familiar with this. Perhaps you are, I hope you're not, but data is often scattered across so many different tools that we have in K-12 schools. And because of that, it's really difficult to draw insights and see a child holistically. But with Otis, teachers can really gather data from any assessment. So including the ones taken outside of Otis, they can also visualize progress and then act on what they're seeing. So take action on what the data shows with progress monitoring plans. And that's kind of the Otis in a nutshell, but this slide on my screen here adds a little bit more context on really the continuum of what that looks like. Seeing a child holistically really starts with seeing all of their historical and current data, that third-party data from all the different tools that you use in a single place. You can see I have there that managing third-party data. Today, we're talking a lot about tier 1. So think about the power of seeing your formative and summative assessment data side by side with that universal screening data, or measures such as NWEA map. We know we are very data rich. If you have a 5th grade student who's maybe been taking these assessments for several years, you can see their entire growth journey from, when they were working on letter identification to now perhaps their comprehension, all in a single place. So that's what I mean by managing that third-party data, or all of those assessments that you have. No matter where the data is from, you can use it to create custom reports to really analyze what you're seeing, which of course can be used to drive instruction. But we've been talking today a lot about, pre-assessment, classroom assessments, and that is just so important, whether it's, more formal or informal, such as a fist to 5, like Amanda was sharing, to, collect or gauge the student's level of understanding. You can definitely administer any type of assessment in Otis, whether it's a pre-assessment, a post-assessment, a benchmark, a formative, a summative, whether it counts or doesn't count, you name it, you can do all of that in Otis. And those assessments can be aligned to standards, which is just so important, because you want to be able to look at the skill in all of the corresponding assessments. Like, here's my skill, how did I perform on the pre? And then the post. Or maybe we mastered on the pre and we're skipping over that standard and instruction so that it's really meaningful, relevant, and engaging to your class. If students already know the content, they're going to start acting out, and they're going to, you're going to create a whole other culture of conversation around classroom management, because students aren't engaged or interested if it's not relevant. And that's how data can really help us. But what separates Otis from other tools is you can use all of this data to act on student needs. And that's really monitoring student progress. If data reveals the need for additional support, what most times happens is teachers start a Google Doc or a Google form and have this data living in someone's drive. But with a tool like Otis, if the data reveals the need for additional support, you can add them to a plan in the same place where their data is already at to track, maybe it's academic, social, emotional, maybe it's, a goal related to their attendance, because if our students aren't in school, they're not going to be able to make progress and learn with us. So these are really tools that are the perfect partner to an MTSS framework. But with our focus being on assessment and tier 1, thinking about that common assessment that everyone might take, or common learning standards you might be measuring, I just want to mention a couple of ways that Otis can support that. We do have pre-built options in Otis so that you don't have to spend the time, building an assessment to measure the learning standards. Of course, you can always build your own. I have a couple of examples on the screen here just to kind of set the stage or add context. But you can see we have, thousands of standard aligned assessments. We have assessments from K-12 curricula you may already be using with your students in the program. So when you administer an assessment in Otis, the benefit is really all of the data. And when you can focus less on the grading and the distribution, you can focus more on those student outcomes. So this just adds a little bit of context to the different types of assessments, but the power is really in the data. And I'm just going to click ahead here. Sorry about that. Clicked the wrong way. But I want to show you a couple of examples of what I mean by using data to drive instruction and how these digital assessments can streamline the whole process for you. So once you give any assessment, no matter what type it is, you can view performance overall. So, how did overall my students do? That's usually like the first thought. You can also look by class. So maybe period 1, 2, maybe you have 6 classes, or maybe you're a co-teacher who supports 6 classes and you want to see how each one did on the assessment. I think that's such a powerful tool as a team. So really look in and say, hey, why is my first period class outperforming all of the students in my 8th period class? Is it time of day? What's going on there? Is it the makeup of the students? Do we need to do something different? That's where that differentiation really comes in. You're focused less on grading and more on, okay, what am I seeing? You can also disaggregate the data by student group. So think about your IEP students. How did they perform in comparison to the rest of my students? Or my students whose English is not their first language? By gender, if you teach multiple grade levels, by grade level, by race, ethnicity, lots of options there. And these are all auto-populated in real time after your students take the assessment. So you're not having to go through the trouble of, building these visualizations. They're just available as a result of giving an assessment aligned to standards. I really love this visual here. It's a question analysis. So if I'm in my team meeting and we're looking at the assessment results, maybe we're wondering, why did everybody struggle on this question? Why did 33% of the class get the answer right? What did they all choose? What do we need to go back and do? Or alternatively, was this question not worded properly? Let's reread it ourselves and look at it before we pick this standard, which you can see on my screen here. It does show the standard. Before we pick the standard to reteach, we can, dig into those types of variables. And kind of speaking of standards or drilling into that a little bit deeper, because that's just so important with your pre or post assessment. When you're planning what you're going to teach, you need to know what standards or what type of content your students need to be retaught or is an area of focus. So envision you're pulling up this on your screen during your PLC and you're trying to identify what you're going to reteach right out of the gate here. I can see that first standard, this math standard, 15 students in my class are emerging on that standard. So the most of my students are not at mastery or whatever your language is. This is just an example. Perhaps you're using like a 1 through 4 scale. That can be, let's say emerging is a 1. They're at a 1 out of 4. Right away, I know, yes, we're going to cover that. And then I can kind of map out how we're going to cover it. But maybe we're not going to cover this last standard here because most of my students are meeting or mastering that standard. So that's really where you can start to see your instruction become data-driven because you've got the data here as a result of whatever your assessment is. As a former special ed teacher, I did small group instruction every day, pretty much all day. But my small groups all worked on different things. And this is the tool that I'm using to group my students. This is all interactive. So you can click into a section where it says students are emerging, add them to a group. And then I know those are the kiddos who need to be working on that standard with me in small group. That might be different than maybe the group that Keisha and Amanda are in. And we can really personalize learning more efficiently when the data is digestible in this particular way. And you can see if you click into each level or any level, Otis will tell you the names of those students. So you can see, who's approaching, who's meeting, and kind of reorganize the data by whatever is meaningful to you. So these are really just a couple of different visuals of how you can use data from any type, whether it's a pre, a post assessment, your end of the unit assessment, all of these visuals, no matter what time it is throughout the unit, it's useful to know or have that temperature check. It can just be a real quick, simple 5-question, assessment that you create using one of our item banks and search by standard to locate, check it in, see how students are doing, and then use the data to decide, okay, how much longer are we going to spend on this? But all of this helps to remove that collection aspect so that you're more focused on, what's next. I've done this with Otis and I've done this manually with a million Google Sheets when I was teaching. So I can definitely say with certainty that leveraging technology to analyze data in this way is a game changer. I know I felt just more confident when my lessons were created using data, and I saw students more engaged because I was responsive to their needs and planned around what they might be interested in. When I was co-teaching a science class, we were working, with the NGSS standards for middle school, and I was always we gave a pre-assessment, and I was going through and I'd see the scores. I was always so impressed by how many students were actually able to fully meet or master the standard before we'd even taught. And I'd sit there with the teacher that I was co-teaching with, and we'd like move students around. We had little Post-its is how we did it, but we'd move students around and say, like, they already know this, like they don't need to be in that group focused on that. So we could give them then something that would actually interest them, especially in middle school at any level, but middle school especially. It's so important to keep those students, ready and engaged, and data can really change the game for how you do that. So if you want to learn more about Otis, we are at otis.com. Would love to continue the conversation, but hopefully those visuals are helpful to answer the question there.
Hey, Kendall, I want to go back to your last example. And because one thing we haven't really talked about is extension. Amanda and I, like, we've been friends forever, but we normally talk about kind of the intervention side of it, but we recognize and we do believe that there's an extension side too, and that's just as important. So you've got these kids that come into the classroom, you see that they've already mastered the standard. You can't just be like, well, you've already mastered it. If you want to get out your Game Boy and play, we'll be back. You've got to provide extension. And so this kind of a dashboard helps you see what kind of extension activities you might need to plan and what kind of reteaching you might need to do, or what kind of initial introduction you might need to do. It really gives you so much clarity on how to prepare to attack that standard in your classroom.
It's so true. And one of the questions I hear a lot of teachers say, or especially as they're like exploring technology, they're like, why am I locked into using, 6th grade standards if I'm got students in my class who should be on 7th and some should be on 4th, and technology should not limit you in that capacity. So if that's something you're encountering, definitely go the other way. If you're a 6th grade teacher and your students have mastered, whatever standards you're working on, go up. You can tap into, questions and resources from different levels. And I really think that's where a data dashboard helps you, because it's so right. We're always focused on finding those cusp kids who are being slipped through the cracks, which is so important. But when you have all this data, it's a little bit easier to, see and locate students. You can focus on both ends, because there are so many students who might be mastering right out of the gates, and they're going to need a little additional rigor. And it's just as important to provide those students with the additional support, additional opportunities for them to continue and extend, rather than, as you said, like, hey, pull out your computer, free time. You already mastered this, but the rest of the class didn't. Like, we have lots of kids in our class, and it's hard to meet everyone's needs. But with tools that tell us where people are at, we can be a bit more responsive.
Right. Proactively, before you're in front of the class saying, how many of you know, blah, 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 you can look and tell ahead of time. We're getting a few questions in, so I'm going to ask some of the questions, and then we can come back to discussion, because we all love to chat. I'm going to go, for the purpose of our amazing audience, even though you might have put your question in a hot minute ago, I'm going to start with the first one that I see, which is from Deborah. And Deborah's asking, can I upload data from Google Sheets into Otis?
Yeah, so when you get started using any data program, you can look back historically at how you've been collecting data and bring that into Otis. So you certainly could do that. I would say you'll be able to eliminate the Google Sheets and just use, the program to track data moving forward, but you can absolutely upload historical data from those Google Sheets. If you have test scores, we have lots of schools like with their Fontes and Pinnell reading levels in a Google Sheet, they'll send those over to us and we'll upload all of that, so you have that really good historical picture. But the beauty of using an assessment program like Otis is you won't have to tally up anything into a Google Sheet. I mean, if you want to, you can export it from Otis into a Google Sheet. If you're really tied to it, you can, but you won't have to do that anymore, because it'll tally up all the data for you and put it into the visuals.
And if she has like 5,000 Google Sheets like I do, could she those come into Otis, and then you can make beautiful graphs? And
we have a data team that does that for you. Yeah, so I've done the data upload before.
There you go, Deborah.
Somebody shared a folder with me once of like their K5 last 6 years historical reading benchmarks, and we can do wonders with spreadsheets. As long as you have it in a spreadsheet, it can be
It
up there.
doesn't matter what kind of spreadsheet. All right. And then Jeanette asked, and Amanda, you answered this in people who aren't maybe monitoring chat, that they
Mhm.
asked, what would some examples of assessments for tier 2 and tier 3 be? And Amanda answered, I'm gonna turn it over to you to answer that.
Okay, sounds good. So there a lot of the same types of assessments that we use in tier 1, we can also use in tier 2, but it just becomes more personal because it's student by student. So you can use exit slips in tier 2, you can use observations, it might be a checklist for your small group. I mean, Kendall, when she brought up sticky notes, I actually, when I'm working with a small group, I have a sticky note in front of me. Like I have like a little kidney shaped table. And so I'll have a sticky note in front of each student, but closer to me, that I can just their first names on it. And I just quick write down my observations and what happened during that small group right then and there, so that it's nothing formal or fancy. It's literally just a sticky note. But then what I can start to do is I can start to see the trend in my notes towards that particular student and the goal. So there's a lot of different ways in order to provide those progress monitoring checks that are so important in tier 2 and tier 3. It's just really what works for you, what works for your students, what you're comfortable with. And as you start to do it more, then your mode of assessment in terms of progress monitoring might change because you're more used to it, you're more comfortable, or what works for you, it works for your students.
Perfect. Okay, this one, Kendall, is for you. What are some ways that Otis can help with differentiation when delivering a pre or post assessment?
Great question. So when you're thinking about differentiation, you have lots of students, lots of different needs. I used to also do this with sticky notes. I had my students in different groups on sticky notes. Technology can absolutely help with this. So in Otis, we have what's called student groups, and they can be based on things that maybe you don't set for the student, such as their demographic, or if they have a 504 plan, like based on their actual needs that are shared with you when they come into the classroom. That's all in your student information system. So that's one type of student group, but you can also create groups for differentiation. So if I'm looking at the data, I can actually add students who are not meeting a standard to a group, or add students who are extending to a group, so that I can differentiate when I assign out content to them. So I can choose that group as an actual filter to tell the system, these kiddos are only working on this particular assessment. Whereas my students who are extending, I'm assigning them something a little bit different, maybe something that hits a higher, DOK level, whatever it may be. But it's basically you telling the system, these students get this and those students get this, but you don't have to manually check or write their names out. Like Keisha gets level 1. They're in a group, so the system just sends that out to them. And the beauty of this is students never know what the person next to them is working on. So if you're an elementary teacher and you've got your lions, tigers, and bears, your 3 groups of students, you can assign out all your work to the lions, tigers, and bears. Students will never know which group they're in. They won't know if my work is more challenging than yours. They won't know, maybe you're using like text to speech for students so that they just plug in their headphones. They don't need to leave for a reader. You can also assign that out through a student group so that students are really able to receive what they need, but in a less invasive way. Which I think is, really, really important in the classroom, and for educators to be able to just manage the day-to-day. Those student groups are super useful. One other way I would say that you can differentiate pretty easily within Otis is, let's say somebody shares something with me, like Amanda created this great pre-assessment. She just sends it to me. I look at it, I'm like, that's good, but my students aren't there quite yet. I just want to make a slight tweak. With one click, I can clone it and just edit what I want, so that I don't impact her work, but use the same assessment. So it gets really beneficial for that kind of differentiation of content, but you can also differentiate in terms of what students do see and experience. So it's a good question. Thank you for asking that.
Excellent. I think this is another good question. It's around common assessments. So we have common benchmark assessments that districts typically invest in, but common assessments like grade level, maybe even you can have common assessments in a particular school, but how would you work toward common assessments? What suggestions might you have to collectively to create common assessments so that you can pre-assess and collectively use the data to plan instruction?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to the standard, obviously. So you've heard that a lot during this session, but it truly is so important when we're assessing our students is that we have that learning target or that grade level standard in mind. So thinking about what are the like if you're talking about a common assessment for a unit, what are those big standards that are covered and taught and assessed within a unit? And that those are the ones that you're going to include on your common assessment. Now, I'm always one for with assessment is less is more. So in terms of the assessment itself, if you can find questions or tasks that will assess more than one standard in one task, you've hit the jackpot, because then you're having your students do less, but you're able to gather the same amount of data as you would if you were providing multiple tasks or multiple questions. So it isn't easy to come up with assessments, and when you're working with a team, it's really important that everybody does have that shared vision in order to make those common assessments beneficial and efficient and effective for your use. But once they're done, and once you've worked the conversations that you have alone, with your team, I mean, they build you as an educator and as a professional. So it's not only is it something that can be used in your classrooms, but it's also a really effective practice within your buildings.
Yeah. And our next question, I don't mean to cut you off, Kendall, but I do want to address this last question about medical fragile students and
Mhm.
how to assess them. We're running out of time.
Yep.
But I think that when I was superintendent, we had um programs in our two schools in our district that were non-ambulatory students. So they came in either on beds or wheelchairs. And we still had ways that we designed assessments. We did lean into common assessments for them, and we actually ended up working more with their IEP plans and what was, their targeted goal. It took a lot of organization and coordination. I'm super kudos to the principal, Jerry Altieri, who's still principal today, and Robbie Hampton, who's not principal, but she's the one that set it up. Got to give them kudos because they were the ones that said, we need an interventionist, we need a coach. These are schools that typically wouldn't get funding for those kinds of positions, right? They get a lot of special ed funding for people assistants, aides, and things like that, but not as much on the academic side. And those two principals said, we got to have it, and put a plan in play so that they could design common assessments. Otis in Kendall, correct me if I'm wrong, but Otis doesn't care what kind of data you put in it. It's just a place to hold the data. And so if you have data that come from those kinds of plans for your medically fragile students and assessments that are designed specific to their needs and their IEPs and their goal statements, then that could be put into Otis just like any other piece of data. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely. For that specific population, we see lots of teachers using like custom rubrics, to be able to observe the student doing something where they're not in a situation, where they're going to log into the computer and they're going to take an actual test, or maybe they're going to receive some kind of support as they're going through it. There's so many different ways you can observe and track and collect progress towards whatever the goal may be. And to your point, the system, doesn't discriminate based on whatever the goal is. It just gives you a place to track and collect that data so you can use it to make those informed decisions about really where they're at in particular or in relation to where they should be.
Perfect. Yay. We're on time, ladies. So glad to be part of this conversation. Talking about instruction and data is where I can really geek out, and I'm super thankful to be able to have Amanda and Kendall to have that geek time today, and all the amazing people that joined us today for our time together. Thanks again to Otis for making our time possible, and to the audience who showed up, and their wonderful Deborah and Jeanette and, oh my goodness, I forgot the last name and I've already arrowed down. I'm so sorry, that asked those questions. Um, I always enjoy spending time with you during our Tech and Learning Leadership Roundtables, and I'm grateful for my partnership with Tech and Learning, and look forward to sharing new roundtable topics with you soon. Be sure to check out the Tech and Learning website, the Otis website, K20 Connect website, First Education website. There's a lot of websites you can check out just from being part of today's webinar. And you'll find all the great information about the work that each of us do every day. Sign up for the leadership newsletter to Tech and Learning and K20 Connect have joined forces to put out a newsletter every week. So be sure to sign up for that. You can access that through the K20 Connect website at the bottom of the page, or the Tech and Learning website. And most importantly, as we enter into this Thanksgiving season, thank you for being here, for being teachers, for being in the field, for being committed to the education of the great children in this country. And we all deserve a great teacher, and everybody that showed up on this webinar today, including our amazing panelists, are great teachers, great educators, and great educators make the world a better place. So have a great Thanksgiving holiday, everybody, and we'll see you back here in the future.